Welcome to the Martin Bailey Photography Show. It's September 28, 2015, and this is episode 490. This is the final part in a series of Travelogue style episodes to walk you through my recent visit to Namibia, co-hosting an amazing photography tour with my friend Jeremy Woodhouse. We pick up the trail on August 22 as we visit a second Himba village for possibly one of the most beautiful cultural exchanges of my life. Although the people at the first village we visited were genuine and friendly, the people at the second village seemed to welcome us so warmly into their community, actually thanking Jeremy for arranging the tour. We laughed together, played together, and even danced together, making it a wonderful morning. Having photographed the gentleman in this first photo around the fire outside, I asked him if he would allow me to photograph him inside a hut, and this is the first of two of those images. He had with him a pipe made from a spent bullet shell, so I asked him if he could light it. I have a whole series of images of him as he lit the pipe with a smouldering log from the fire in the hut, but as I try to keep the number of images down to 10 per episode, we can't look at all of these. We're actually already going to look at 12 today anyway, as I couldn't remove any more from this final episode's selection. I shot this image at f4 ISO 3200 for a 100th of a second. As I mentioned last week, although it can seem counterintuitive, it's often better to increase your ISO past levels that you would usually be comfortable with to keep grain from becoming a problem in dark situations like this. Unlike the Himba photos that we looked at last week though, this image is actually straight out of the camera, with no exposure adjustments or radial filter, etc. I actually don't feel that this image needs any modification. The only thing that I wish I'd done is include just a little bit more along the bottom of the frame to include or to complete that neckband. I went to portrait orientation for this next photograph though, which I really like. The camera settings were exactly the same as the previous image. The man in these photographs is called Hidian, and he was a wonderful character. I really wish I could show more photos of him, and I might do at some point, but he was kind and giving of his time and had a beautiful smile which he showed me often. In post-processing, I did apply a radial filter to this photograph to highlight Hidian's face by darkening the surroundings a little, but otherwise this is untouched. I might remove that little brown ball in the bottom right corner at some point, but I'm not sure it concerns me enough to bother. After photographing Hidian in his hut for a while, I went outside, and although I made a few more photographs, I ended up spending a whole lot of time just playing with the children. One of them, a little boy with a warm coat and no pants, had a tennis ball and he threw it to me. This boy couldn't have been much more than 2 years old with a wonderful snotty nose from the cold, but his smile lit up the entire village. I was also reminded of how amazing children are at mimicking adults to learn languages. A few times I said yay as I threw the ball to him, and just after a few times he started to say yay as he threw it back. The next time I tried da 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 da, and sure enough he mimicked me exactly the same way as he threw the ball back. Then 2 older children came along to join in the game, and I tried to throw the ball to each of them in turn, yet whenever I threw it to one of the other kids, the other 2 would look hurt as though I'd done them a huge disjustice. And of course, as is often the case with kids, the game went on and on. It actually came to an end as one of them noticed that I had something in my vest pocket and came over to tap it, and as I mentioned last week, he whispered in my ear, "Water." I felt really, really bad for these little children that, they were happy and enjoyed playing, but the prospect of getting a drink from what they thought was a flask of water in my pocket, not a lens, it just trumps any fun that they might have been having. I remember touching their hands and being amazed at just how dry their young skin was. Thankfully though, our visit and the supplies that we bring them in payment helps these people as they live hard lives in these desert conditions. Another way that the Himba village capitalizes on visits from groups like ours is that they set up little shops to sell us bracelets and other trinkets. I actually have strict orders from home that we don't need any more souvenirs from places that I visit, so I try to resist, but at this town I broke down and bought a wooden zebra as it had this look on its face that I knew my wife couldn't resist. And it's now beside our TV in the lounge, so my gut feeling panned out on this. It would have been relegated to my desk in my studio if that hadn't worked out. After we'd finished buying our souvenirs, the Himba people thanked us again for visiting and gave us a surprise dance. The Himba dances don't seem to be as ritualized as you see in some other African countries, but as you can see in this photo, they're dynamic and photogenic. So I was thrilled to experience this. I'd started off with the fastest shutter speed, freezing the motion as each person came out of the line at the back to do their dance, basically stomping their feet and kicking up dust. But I wanted to capture that motion in my still photographs, so I reduced my shutter speed to a 100th of a second, which did the trick. Of course, I have subject movement throughout the lady in the foreground, but the movement comes across more strongly in this image than the faster shutter speeds. I also used an aperture of f11 so that the people in the row at the back were also relatively sharp at 53mm, and that all gave me an ISO of 200. In addition to the expression on the dancing lady's face, the thing that I really like about this photograph is that all of the people's faces are happy as they enjoy the dance, and I absolutely love the look on the lady to the far right's face. She seems to be literally creased up with laughter. Again, I have other photos that I'd like to share, but we have to move on for now. I'll probably put a slideshow together at some point with some video interwoven as well, as I have so much more to share than the 53 images that we'll have looked at through these 5 parts. After this, a number of the people, Jeremy and our guide, actually went in and started to dance with the group, and it was, like I say, it was just one of these amazing cultural experiences that I won't forget. After we left the village, we went back to the riverbed of the Huanib River, where I had my first encounter with wild lions, as we can see in this image. These are desert-adapted lions that had just taken down a young giraffe. I must admit, I'm a little bit disappointed that my first encounter with wild lions wasn't in a more beautiful surrounding, but it was still a very magical experience. Some of the other photos I have are a little bit more gruesome. We would come back to this location a number of times over the following 3 days and watch this pride strip the giraffe to the bone. Literally, on the 3rd day, all that was left was an almost totally clean ribcage, some legs, and a lower jaw. I won't describe some of the other photos that I have, but let me just say that the people making the documentaries that we see on TV must be very careful with what they show us. I shot this at f8 with a shutter speed of 1/250th of a second and an ISO of 2000 at 200mm. The funny thing is, as we tried to drive up the sandy bank as we left this spot, our car got stuck and we had to get out and dig it out and then push the car until we could free it. Our guide told the ladies to stay in the vehicle and us men were all told not to wander off. It was slightly unnerving to see one of the lions come over towards us a little and then sit down in some foliage, just watching as we messed around with our Land Rover. I would have been a lot more worried, of course, if they didn't already have a giraffe to feast on. The following day, we drove over to a place called Moe Bay, but due to a miscommunication between our drivers, we thought we were late, so we rushed off ahead trying to catch up with the other vehicle, and then our driver lost the track and we ended up getting totally grounded with our Land Rover sort of stuck on a dirt bank, and spent an hour or so getting it off. It turns out that the other group were behind us and we met up before heading over to the coast. The scenery from the vehicle was amazing as we drove over this beautiful, the brightest yellow sand dunes that you can imagine. But with the time that we'd lost getting grounded, we only had like 20 minutes for lunch by the sea, and then called by a Cape fur seal colony briefly before we had to start driving back to our camp. Just for the record, here's a photo of some of the fur seals that I shot through the window of the Land Rover. I waited until the wave in the background started to break to add an extra element of interest, and tried to find a good place on either side of the frame to cut off the seals, but I'm happy enough with how this turned out. I shot this at f11 with a shutter speed of 400th of a second at ISO 250 and a focal length of 400mm. The next day, August 24, was pretty amazing as we tracked individual desert elephant bulls around the riverbed and then found a herd of them, which we'll look at over the next 7 images with just one oryx photo thrown in for good measure. We stayed with the bull that you can see in this image for about an hour as he walked, stopping occasionally to feed on seeds and leaves from the many anna trees that lined the riverbed. We were so close to the bull that I had to wait for him to start to curl his trunk a little so that I could fit him all in the frame at 100mm, the widest that I could go with my 100 to 400mm lens. I'm going to continue to share the rest of these photos in colour, although I think I'll end up processing some of these into black and white at some point. It's a hard decision to make though, as although I don't necessarily like the drab browns, this is the environment that these animals live in, so I also feel that I want to leave the colour in there as it is as well. We continued to follow this guy and I have way more photos than I need of him, but I did try to only shoot when something cool was happening, like when he kicked up the dust as he walked down a slight embankment that we can see in this photograph. We were still quite close to the elephant when I shot this at 148mm, which is partly why his actions were a little bit exaggerated, as he was kind of warning us not to get any closer. It's not good to cause wild animals to change their actions, but the riverbed is so narrow in places that it's unavoidable to a degree. Of course, when it gets very narrow and the elephant was on the move, we stayed back to give him the right of way. I shot this at f9 with a shutter speed of a 500th of a second at ISO 640. I was amazed at the power of these elephants. As we can see in this photo, they sometimes put the bone at the base of their trunks up against the trunk of an anna tree and shake the entire tree to shake down any loose seeds or foliage, which they can then walk around and pick up off the floor to eat. If you click on the image to view it larger on the blog, you can probably just about make out a few of the larger bits falling from the tree just above the elephant. Again, I also like how there is dust pluming up around the elephant's feet in this photo, which I shot at f10 for 500th of a second at ISO 500 and a focal length of 400mm. This next photograph just makes me smile. I pulled back a little for this one to 330mm to include more of the tree and put the elephant in his environment. But I love how close together his feet are as he starts to walk towards us. It reminds me of a model on the catwalk, because if you look closely, the left leg is actually crossing over the right like a model does when they're strutting their stuff. I also like the various layers in this image, starting with the tree on the same layer as the elephant, but then there's the sandy bank leading up to the dirt riverbank, and then the hills in the distance, and then the white sky. Again, I don't necessarily like the brown tones, but it is what it is, and now, having been home for a few weeks, these photos are starting to become very fond memories of a wonderful trip. As with my 2013 visit to Namibia, I found myself with many shots of oryx just standing there in their environment. However nice the environment sometimes is, I had been hoping for something more. This very thought was going through my mind as I framed up the oryx in this next photograph, as he was just standing there looking at our vehicle, and then he just took off. Luckily, I already had a shutter speed of a 500th of a second set, and I always use AI servo focus mode when I'm shooting wildlife, so I was able to track with him for my first oryx action photo, with dust kicking up and everything. As I said earlier, although we usually stick to 10 images per episode, I couldn't remove any more from today's selection, so we'll go on and do 2 more elephant shots before we finish. Here we see a different bull from the one that we've looked at so far, from a herd that we were photographing later in the day on August 24. I quite like this, mainly for the pose. Front on, and this guy doesn't have a broken tusk, which is great. I do wish he didn't have those twigs in his trunk, which would have been a more powerful shot, because it would look like he was about to charge, not have dinner. But still, I'm happy enough with this shot. Just look at the size of his feet too. It's sometimes hard to gauge just how big elephants are from photos, but occasionally when we got out of our vehicles to walk around, we'd see elephant footprints, and they're massive. I shot this at 500th of a second f9 ISO 250 at 312mm. Even if the subject isn't moving around a lot, I generally like to keep the shutter speed at around a 500th of a second when shooting with the 100 to 400 lens, so that I can zoom right into 400mm without worrying too much about camera shake. Of course, you never know when you're going to need a faster shutter speed either, like with the oryx photo, so maintaining a good shutter speed, even faster than a 500th of a second if possible, is always going to help with wildlife photography. On August 25, we had a long drive to where we'd spend our last night, and after 4 days of bush camping, with a hole in the ground for the toilet and a bucket of water hung from a tree for a shower, I was quite looking forward to a nice lodge, but photographically, I don't have much to share from that following day. So we'll finish with this apt photograph from the end of August 24, which was one of the last photographs I shot before we left the herd of desert elephants behind. In my opinion, elephants are one of the few animals that really lend themselves to the often avoided butt shot. Here we see a herd of elephants heading off into the distance, the large brown bull leading the way on the far right, and another bull bringing up the rear, protecting their family as they make their way along the riverbed. As we neared the end of our journey, it felt fitting to watch this herd continue proudly on theirs. Many people have asked if I'll be doing another Namibia tour next year, and at this point I'm afraid that I've got nothing planned. But Namibia is a magical country, and I will go back at some point, so if you would be interested in joining me, sign up for our Tours and Workshops newsletter at mbp.ac/news if you don't already receive this, and you'll be among the first to know when I make an announcement. If you aren't sure if you're signed up or not, fill out the form anyway, and you'll be given a link to modify your profile if it already exists. Also, if you check out our tours and workshops page, which is linked at the top of every page on our website, you will always be able to see a current list of tours that we have planned. I do hope that you've enjoyed this 5-part series covering the photographs from my Namibia trip with Jeremy Woodhouse. I have very much enjoyed bringing this to you. By the time I release this episode, I'll actually be on my second week in Iceland, doing my yearly tour there. So, assuming that I can edit my selects down in time, we'll start a Travelogue series from Iceland next week, so stay tuned for that as well. Thanks very much for listening today. If you enjoy this podcast, please share a link with your friends, and if you don't already, please subscribe in iTunes or your favourite podcast program to ensure uninterrupted delivery. You can find me on Google+, Twitter, Instagram and Facebook, etc. and links to everything that I'm up to are at martinbaileyphotography.com, so do drop by and take a look. I'll be back next week with another episode, but in the meantime, you take care and have a great week, whatever you do. Bye-bye.